Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, when Donald Trump was in the White House giving his inaugural address, Biden and his administration did something shady. They gave a presidential pardon to Fauci and other technocrats to be able to absolve them for what they had done during the pandemic, which we think is a disgrace and motivates our side of the House. Yes, technocrats, doctors, people who have specialization are important, but we think the very nature of them being specialized, the very nature of them being proximate, the very nature of them having most to lose is exactly what limits their ability to truly make an informed decision. And these very people look at the trees, Mr. Speaker, and fail to see the entire forest. The bigger picture of what happens in society and all of the harms we see come as a consequence of being unable to deal with the pandemic. We think the nuance to this particular debate is the idea that particular specific knowledge is important, but having a plurality of beliefs and ideologies is exactly what we need, especially when we're dealing with an invisible enemy. Ladies and gentlemen, something that has been unfounded, something that we cannot tell, something that we cannot see. We need every full range of capacity to be able to deal with it. And the very fact that you only look at a public health crisis through the lens of medicine and through the lens of physiology is exactly what limits your ability to do that. We think that in status quo, what ultimately happens is that these very technocrats, even if they're doing good, and this is taking government side at their best, can actually lead to a host of particular harms and bad things that happened in the wake of the pandemic. Things like inflation, ladies and gentlemen, things like mandating vaccines, which were unable to actually fully go through particular clinical trials. Why? Because they were worried, they were scared, and they believed that was the only chance to be able to do so. But side government might be like, Josef, fuck you, that's a load of hindsight bias. I was able to take the vaccine, I took a booster, I'm fine. Sure, but take a look at many other adolescents and people who eventually had heart problems, ladies and gentlemen, and other physiological ailments as a consequence of these individuals cutting corners and as a consequence of individuals being able to mandate particular policies. We think on our side of the house, and this is me subsuming a lot of what we get from their side, we can have technocrats and status quo, case in point, having a Department of Health, having a health minister, subsuming the benefits they try to say, wherein we tell you we're able to co-opt these individuals and their specialization, but at the same time holding them accountable and allowing these people not to have overrule. The second thing is, I agree with opening government that saving lives is important. But the question is, does the end justify the means? We think we need to be able to have a full and rational picture in order to be able to deal with that. Because these very technocrats whose reputation, business, lineage is on the line, is exactly what leads them to be so fucking anxious, to be so worried, and to be doing everything they can in order to make a marginal change. But ladies and gentlemen, that ability and that fear becomes the very blinder that makes them only look at that particular thing. So if Hesaya says, it's good because these people will be there and no longer be needed at the point in which the thing is done, then the problem then becomes the way in which we can't hold them accountable. Case in point, Biden having to be able to have a presidential pardon given American dissent towards Fauci and their inability to be able to deal with that. The last is this idea of the counterfactual. Why exactly are elected officials better? There are three reasons as such. A, proximity to the people. And I don't mean some vague bullshit democratic idea, but I mean these particular people being voted and chosen as congressperson, as mayor, and as governor. Hence, there being a direct link between me exercising my vote, me paying my taxes, and me choosing you to be able to make those decisions. Even if I disagree, even if you actually mandate these things, even if I don't want to do so, at least there's a more proximate degree of consent to that, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, or B, this idea of it being a check and balance is flipping what Hesaya said about those particular people being appointed and not elected. It's not just about the idea of consent, but the idea that hugas kamay sila at the point in which they're done. Because Fauci can easily run the narrative and say, we're all still alive, aren't we? but at the wake and at the expense of many Americans who are suffering, not just physiologically, but also the economic aftermath when we realized that the lockdown didn't work and taking care of these things wasn't necessarily the worst. Last exactly, and C, is this idea of the specialization. The lack of specialization coming from politicians is exactly what leads to a better host of discussion, wherein particular individuals are able to acknowledge those blind spots of other people, while at the same time acknowledging the very people who have specialization and agreeing and coming to terms. Yeah, things might take a bit longer, but we rather do that as opposed to rushing into things like what we did with vaccine. Go ahead, PY.
OO assumes that the problem is that Anthony Fauci was the position that was at the helm when it came to making these decisions. That's false, right? It's probably because of the fact that he was represented by all of these other factors that made him be all of these ways, make all of these incorrect decisions.
Yeah, but the decisions in terms of them making it all came from the fucking NHS and Fauci. Meaning, yeah, you had these politicians saying shit, but they were all counseled by this individual who had certain ideas in terms of dealing with the pandemic. Mandating vaccines, or else if not, you're a fucking anti-vaxxer and enemy of the state. Being able to say that these lockdowns are ultimately necessary and shutting the economy had to be done. Yes, in hindsight, we realize that these things necessarily were not the case, but we think it wouldn't have to be through the lens of hindsight if we were able to have rational discussion and not looking at medicine because, doktor ka, may alam ka, nag-aral ka. As an absolute truth, Mr. Speaker, we recognize, yes, they have specialization, but the point in which we treat everything they say as dogma, or else you get cancelled, or you're a fucker, or you're stupid, is exactly where we draw the line. We think that particular politicians are ultimately better precisely because you have more of them, and the fact that these particular people, because they want to get re-elected, they don't want to let people down, they want to forward their political career, is exactly at the point in which they're likely to rectify mistakes they've done in the past and ultimately do their best not to make these mistakes in the future. What have we told you from opening opposition? Very simple. We cast light on specifically the exclusive harms of technocrats, and we told you the counterfactual of exclusive benefits of particular politicians who we think are better in terms of making decisions, especially at the point in which it's actually unfamiliar, especially at the point in which we are uncertain. We are very proud to stand on side opposition.